Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Paul and I'm from Eracy. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar on the National Early Language and Literacy Strategy. Today you'll be hearing from Dr. Rebecca Goodhue, General Manager Capacity Building at Eracy. We'll also hear from Tanya Serry, Associate Professor, Literacy and Reading, School of Education at La Trobe University. Tanya is also affiliated with the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. Now, before we go any further, just some brief housekeeping. As shown on the right of this next slide, you should be able to see the GoToWebinar app. By clicking the orange arrow button, you can open and close the app to either get it out of the way or access its features. The small white triangles on various panes or panels on this app let you collapse to reveal different controls. The audio pane lets you choose how to listen to the webinar and test your audio settings. So if you have any issues with audio during the webinar, you can switch, for example, from the default of computer audio to instead listen by phone using the dial-in number and PIN. Microphones are muted, but you can ask questions at any time by typing them into the questions pane. Time permitting, we'll get to your questions during the Q&A session after the presentations. If we do happen to run out of time, you'll still be able to email questions through. We'll be able to deal with them on notice. Today's webinar is being recorded and it'll be made freely available online as soon as possible, technology willing. I'd now like to hand you over to Dr. Goodhue.
Thanks, Paul. I'm delivering this webinar from the lands of the Ngunnawal people and pay my deep respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various land upon which you work today, and I acknowledge that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I also acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. I'm Rebecca Goodhue and I'll be talking about the strategy development and the evidence reviews. And Tanya will later then speak about the development and the importance of early language and literacy. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope some of you had a chance to read the NELLC, the National Early Language and Literacy Strategy discussion paper. We released that last week. If you didn't have a chance, it is available at the website that is on the slide currently, earlylanguageandliteracy.org.au. on the information tab. So firstly, why do we need a national strategy for early language and literacy? Well, currently there's no national coordinated approach for supporting under 5-year-olds language and literacy development. And this is problematic. It adds to the inconsistencies around the programs and approaches that our little ones receive. And by having a national strategy, it's going to allow decision makers, service providers and families to be guided by an overarching and evidence-based framework that will help inform decisions, work and interactions that will improve our kids' language and emergent literacy skills. So broadly, a national strategy is going to do 3 things. 1, it's going to establish a common understanding about what actually early language and literacy is. 2, it's going to reflect and then build upon the existing strategies, initiatives and services and programs that are currently out there. And 3, it's going to identify priorities. So where do we need to focus our resources to ensure that the strategy is touching on the relevant areas and systems and mechanisms to be effective. In terms of why reading, writing and language are so important, Tanya is going to speak to that later. So how did this initiative come about? About 5 years ago, the library associations and organisations like Eracy came together with a mutual understanding of the deep importance about supporting language and literacy in the preschool years. And we, 10 NGOs, you can see on the screen there, all with a vested interest in language and literacy, formed a coalition the National Early Language and Literacy Coalition, or NELLC, to add to the acronyms of the world. A central point of discussion in the coalition was the realisation that Australia lacks a national strategy in this space, that we needed funding to do anything about this. So the coalition was successful in securing a 3-year grant from the Ian Potter Foundation, to whom we're extremely grateful. And we also have in-kind support and involvement from 4 federal government departments: the National Indigenous Australians Agency, Department of Social Services, Education Department, and Department of Health. On top of all the stakeholders that you can see here, there are also NGO stakeholders, other NGO stakeholders, and other government representatives from every state and territory from across departments such as Education, Health, Premier and Cabinet. You can see it's a pretty broad stakeholder group, and I think that speaks to the critical importance of ensuring that our kids have the best foundation possible for one of the most vital life skills, communication. So right now we're at the start of year 3, the final year of the project, but we really hope that this work is going to continue beyond the life of the grant completion. As with almost all work this year, COVID has impacted our ability to proceed as planned, and we did design a co-design process that wasn't able to occur as we had hoped. However, we do have proposed priorities of the strategy. Sorry, Pika, there's a few questions. So the proposed priorities are family support within communities, early education and transitions, specialist support, and knowledge production and dissemination. I'm going to quickly go through those 4 in a bit more detail. Apologies for the dense, text-heavy slide here. It is the most packed priority, but essentially it covers ensuring that anyone who interacts with kids under 5 understand what early language and literacy entails, the importance of it, how to best support it in a culturally responsive and evidence-based way, and includes the digital technology and use of public libraries. Now, the discussion paper I mentioned earlier that we released last week, one of the conversations that has sparked from that release of the discussion paper has to do with where public libraries sit within this strategy. Currently, public libraries, well, they typically sit under the community service umbrella, and which is why they're seen in this first priority here. But as one stakeholder phrased it, public libraries are gasping for air under that umbrella. And considering this strategy is for children under 5 and it surrounds language and literacy, the question is, and something that we need to workshop, should there be a priority within the strategy that is dedicated to public libraries? So should we be aiming to pull out public libraries from under that huge community services umbrella and provide public library space where there's plenty of air to breathe? And so essentially, are libraries justified in having a standalone priority? And if not, why not? So that's an example of the type of question that we as a working group need to workshop to finalise these priorities. The second priority is around early education and transitions. It looks to ensure that educators have evidence-based training in early language and literacy, both pre-service and ongoing throughout their careers. This priority maintains that all 3- and 4-year-olds in Australia have access to free preschool. And lastly, that the right measures of early language and literacy are being used so that we know where the kids are at in their skills in that space, and so that they can be met at the right level when they do start school. The third priority is around specialist support and ensures that the children who need extra or specialised support are identified early and that there's equitable access to receive the support they need. I'm sure a lot of people online here today understand that in many cases and places in Australia, because of the length of waiting lists, early intervention In some cases doesn't exist. So we have a lot of work to do in this space and at a structural and system level. The final proposed priority is ensuring that the information is created and shared, and that is getting disseminated to the relevant stakeholders. That there's support for research and evaluation regarding early language and literacy interventions, programs, and initiatives. So those are the 4 proposed priorities of the National Strategy for Early Language and Literacy. Part of the work that we've been doing is an evidence review. This has been done over the last 12 to 18 months, and it looked at both universal approaches, so approaches that are going to enhance early language and literacy for all children, and another review focused on targeted approaches. And those targeted approaches looked at what approaches are going to work or what evidence there are for 3 groups. The first group being disadvantaged communities and families that were identified through experiencing low socioeconomic status. 2, culturally and linguistically diverse families. And the 3rd, Indigenous and First Nations families and communities. You can see that there was inclusion criteria. I'm not going to go into that other than to say the comparable countries. So it was a global review. The comparable countries boiled down to countries that had developed economies. There were thousands of studies to start with. Once we went through the whole process, we ended up with 140 studies being analysed for both universal and targeted approaches. Alongside the evidence reviews, we also did a national program, a call out for national programs that were focused on supporting under 5s early language and literacy currently happening in Australia. And we did that so that we could, it was just a snapshot, it's obviously just a point in time around what is happening on the ground and what is the evaluation aspects, elements to those programs. We ended up with a total of 23 programs for the national program snapshot. Now for the evidence review, we obviously looked at what evidence there were for each approach and then graded them according to the level and robustness of that evidence. So the grading went from well supported to right down to unknown or failed to demonstrate any benefits. For the universal approaches, there were no approaches that received well supported. So the first approaches in the universal evidence review received a supported grade. Supported means that there is clear, consistent evidence of beneficial effects with some caveats around implementation in the context of implementation. So what is supported? Approaches for helping kids increase their language and early literacy, or emergent literacy. The first one is reading instruction and intervention, and this was shown to have evidence for 2 areas, and for both receptive language and written language awareness. I don't have time today to talk about the definition of each area, but if you are not familiar with these phrases, then please do go to that National Early Language and Literacy website that was on the first slide, and the glossaries and definitions in each of the evidence reviews. The next approach is early education services, and that's referring to any kindy, preschool, daycare, ECEC services, and that was had supported evidence for enhancing receptive language. And the last approach that has supported evidence is dialogic reading practices, and that was for expressive language. And Tanya's going to talk about what dialogic reading practices is shortly. excuse me, the promising universal approaches, so those approaches that had a promising grade, which means there is evidence suggestive of beneficial effect, but that further research is required. Was again early education services for 2 areas, expressive language and phonological awareness. Dialogic reading practices for written language awareness. The play-based literacy activities had promising evidence for expressive language and composite early language and literacy skills. Now, this was an area that, because of how the study was designed and reported, we weren't able to pull out the specific area. So there is an impact area called composite early language and literacy skills. And that was also an area that was shown to have promising evidence for family and early literacy campaigns and programs. So the next grade down from promising is emerging. And emerging evidence means there's a low quality evidence suggestive of beneficial effects, and no negative effects are apparent, but further research is required. So the emerging universal approaches were early education services for written language awareness and dialogic reading practices for phonological awareness. Now, what I've just described are the primary outcomes. There are secondary outcomes in the evidence reviews, and again, they are available on that website if you're interested. But the secondary outcomes refer to one step removed from early language and literacy. So an example of a secondary outcome is that early education services showed promising results for improving executive functioning skills in children under 5. So they were the universal approaches. We're now going to move on to the targeted approaches, and the first one being the evidence for families experiencing low socioeconomic status. This cohort, the families experiencing low SES, were the only cohort to receive a well-supported grade. And well-supported means there is clear, consistent evidence of beneficial effect. And this grade of well-supported, you can see, was provided for 2 areas, from 2 approaches, sorry. So reading instruction and intervention, and family and early literacy campaigns and programs, and they both improved composite, so that sort of integrated early language and literacy skills area. Early education services for families experiencing low SES showed supported evidence for 3 areas that you can see there, and promising evidence for 2 other areas. And I've included the secondary outcomes in the targeted approach. You can see executive functioning skills there. The home literacy environment, I should mention, that just refers to the parents' patterns or practice of reading books or book play or literacy-based activities, as well as how many books are in the house type of measure. And the last one for families experiencing low SES are parenting programs. Parenting programs showed evidence for 5 areas, again, very similar to early education services, except the composite early language and literacy skills were supported in the parenting programs. The next targeted cohort was evidence for culturally and linguistically diverse families. And you can see here that early education services showed, again, a lot of evidence, promising for 3 areas. So phonological awareness, emergent literacy, and receptive language, and also emerging evidence for executive functioning skills and home literacy environment. For culturally and linguistically diverse families, there was also emerging evidence of family and early literacy campaigns and programs for the emergent literacy skills. And the last cohort was evidence for First Nations families. And unfortunately, there was scarce evidence for this group, and only emerging evidence for parenting programs, but that did cover 2 areas of both expressive language and the home literacy environment. Before I hand over to Tanya, I'll just quickly talk a bit about the program call out. So I mentioned earlier we received 21 programs or services or initiatives that were currently happening in Australia that were focusing on this age group for language and emergent literacy. Overall, there was very few that had robust evaluation attached to them. There were many who had some sort of evaluation that was more internal, so focus groups or interviews with participants or people involved in the delivery of that. Out of the 23, there were 4 programs that had an independent evaluation examining the impact on children's literacy and language, and there were another 4 that had independent evaluation planned or currently underway. So overall, both for the programs and the approaches, we do need more robust, more independent, and more long-term evaluation to know what is happening in this space in Australia. I'm now going to pass on to Tanya, and she'll speak to you about the importance and development of early language and literacy skills.
And I'm really happy to be here. I would like to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands upon which we meet. I'm meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging as well. I'm going to follow on from Rebecca's presentation by spending about 15 minutes with you providing some context around language and literacy, mainly emergent literacy, and this gives a theoretical rationale for the NELLC coalition. Let's start by just having a look at Jack. Next slide, Rebecca. He's made some comments here that are very, very typical of a 2-year-old. Mum, you sit on there. I do my own self, and Holly got babies in him's tummy. I'm sure that these don't seem at all odd, even though they're grammatically not complete or correct for a child close to age 3. But Jack has actually started school this year, and developmentally he's made huge leaps and advances and filled in all of the grammatical gaps and expanded his vocabulary. And this is exactly what we need to see and try and have more of a level playing field for all children entering school. So my presentation will cover the following. I'd like to just start by talking about why reading is so important. Although reading instruction commences formally beyond the preschool years or beyond the scope of the NELLC coalition, but reading is so highly dependent on the skills that children bring to school in terms of their oral language and their emergent literacy skills. But I'll then focus on the importance of oral language and emergent literacy as precursors to reading, focusing on language acquisition, and then focusing on vulnerabilities, risks or threats to optimal language and emergent literacy development, and finish by talking about why the NELLC strategy is so important for all children, and particularly for those at risk. Let's start with reading. Next slide, maybe Rebecca, if you just go open up the whole slide. Being able to read is profoundly transformative, both for individuals, the individual concerned, and for the population or the community that the individual lives in. We take the individual, it's a start point for becoming literate. Literacy is a language-based skill, so the better developed oral language skills are that children take to school, the more likely that they're going to have success when learning to read and spell. Reading is very important for building knowledge. Once we're readers, we gain most of our knowledge through the written medium as opposed to the oral medium. Reading is clearly important for academic progression and importantly for completing school. We know that students who tend to dip out of school earlier than year 12 are very often profiled as students with significant literacy difficulties. We have lots of evidence that being able to read is extremely important for personal well-being and social success well into the adult years, and gives opportunity for things such as post-school training and employability and economic independence and stability. Thinking about why reading is transformative at a population level, it means that individuals are much more prepared to contribute to the mainstream social and economic fabric of society. There's a significant increase in the likelihood of pro-social behaviours, as well as both physical and mental health and well-being. We also know that those who have strong literacy skills have a much lesser chance of relying on social welfare and, importantly, entering the judicial system. Moving on to the next slide, just some key facts about reading. There's no question that the ultimate aim of reading is to comprehend or gain meaning from written text. In the very early years prior to school, the opportunity to read, and I put that in quotation marks, is an opportunity for young children to gain a lot of knowledge about words, about how stories work, about information, and how the whole print system works. So unlike spoken language, which is innately acquired, we are pre-wired to acquire language for the very, very vast majority of people. Learning to read is a skill that must be learned. So the better prepared that young children are when they enter school, the more likely it is that they're going to have success. So we know that oral language competency is a necessary precursor for learning to read and spell, and is the basis for transitioning to becoming a literate person. If we can move on to the next slide, where I'm going to start focusing on oral language and what we mean by oral language. We intuitively all know what oral language is because it's something we engage in every day. Essentially, it's referring to talking or expressive language and listening or receptive language, but importantly, the mental representations that sit behind them. While it's generally agreed that oral language is essentially the engine room for early reading success, it's not always widely acknowledged and emphasised that once we read, it assists all of us to be able to grow our own oral language development. So through reading, we continue to advance our vocabulary and our knowledge about the world as well. If we think about language acquisition, so the next slide, Rebecca, I can't see where you are, but I'm just assuming that you're keeping up with me, so please let me know if not. I've mentioned that language acquisition is a natural process. We are born with the predetermined ability or pre-wiring to acquire spoken language. You can see under all of those images of children, language is a foundational skill. It's acquired naturally, but it's done so by exposure and engagement in regular interactions with other people. It's a complex combination of environmental factors and the child's biological makeup as well. Language growth is absolutely exponential in the preschool years. So if we think about a newborn, their ways of communicating are largely through vocalizations, crying, and some facial expression. But by the time children enter even kindergarten, they are pretty functional and competent communicators. So there is this exponential growth in the preschool years that we just have to harness. We never get that time back. Those of you who've attempted to learn a second language or a third language beyond those preschool years know that it's much harder than if children are raised in bi or multilingual environments. So that's a really critical time when our brain is so plastic to being able to acquire one language or multiple languages. But you can see that the arrow continues right through the school years and beyond, because we continue to build our language all the time. If we take up a new hobby or get a new job, we learn a whole lot of new vocabulary and conceptual knowledge. So it's an ongoing process, but that early years, those at 0 to 3, 0 to 5 is absolutely critical, where the growth is exponential and something that's quite wonderful as well. So language will continue to grow throughout the school years and well beyond, but rather than being more naturally acquired, a lot of more explicit teaching supports ongoing growth of language in the formal schooling years. And again, the stronger the base of language that children come into, the stronger the point is for building their oral language as they progress through school. So on the next slide, if we think about key premises about oral language, we know that for young children, oral language is expected to develop naturally and effortlessly. We don't teach children every word they know or every word structure, and that process is because we are pre-wired. We know that there is a developmental trajectory of language development, and that's really valuable in helping us determine children who may be falling behind or are at risk as well. And we use language milestones that are very useful clinical resources, but we also know, as I mentioned, that language growth is lifelong as well. So given that we are pre-wired, and onto the next slide about language promotion, the environment plays a big role in how well we acquire language. And I thought this picture really summed up such a natural and lovely interaction that is essentially what's needed for children's language growth in those early years. There are some language promotion techniques. I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with these processes, but I'd just like to highlight these. Essentially, play, which is can be pre-conversational. I mean, can be without words, but play is such a valuable language promotion strategy. We are talking the whole way while we are playing. Even games with young children, infants and early toddlers, where we do things like peekaboo. There's lots of pre-conversational skills that children are immersed in, such as turn taking. So it's my turn, it's your turn, we wait, and so forth. So play is just so critical. Language promotion otherwise occurs in very natural situations. You can see here they're just walking through, looks like sunflower field, and the interactions are often embedded in unstructured interactions within the child's daily routine. So we would really encourage parents and carers to do nothing special, just to talk about hanging the washing, talking about looking at a flower, and so forth. Being responsive to all communication attempts is really valuable. It's giving the infant the message that what they're trying to communicate, even if it's just a vocalization, is valuable and that you will react to it. And expanding the child's utterance, which can be quite instructive. So if the child was, say, pointing to the flower and said to the mother, flower, the mother could expand the child's utterance by saying, yes, a yellow flower, or something. So we've just added some language around that. And we find that parents are almost pre-wired themselves to do that natural expansion of language. We can highlight vocabulary and knowledge about the world when we interact with children. I mentioned before that we don't teach young children every word that they know, and by the time they get to school, they've got a pretty expansive vocabulary. But again, just talking about words and pointing things out is really valuable. This notion of serve and return, if you think about a tennis game, so serving and returning, if we can have communication occurring like a serve and return process, that's what's really valuable for language promotion. And the vast majority of parents are innately wired to do many of these steps, called child-directed language. Research has even shown that older children intuitively use this style of language when interacting with younger children. So using all of these natural, unstructured interactions, slowing down their speech just a fraction, using a much more sing-song intonation to their voice. So instead of that's a flower, it could be, oh, that's a flower. So many parents and carers do this quite automatically. But again, in terms of a strategy, this may be something that we build in for vulnerable children. If we move on to the next slide, Rebecca talked about emergent literacy promotion. Whilst I don't support, and the evidence doesn't indicate that children need to be taught to read as such before going to school, there's so many skills and pieces of knowledge that children can take to school with them that fit under this category of emergent literacy. So I've listed the 4 key ones on the screen. So building written language awareness, which evolves in the years prior to school, and it's essentially awareness about things like how books work, understanding that written text isn't just a series of squiggles, but actually carries meaning. And that links also to print referencing. So the play can be play or just discussion without expecting the children to respond, but just saying, oh, there's the word dog, or there's the A, like your name, Anna, and so forth. So just talking about print without an expectation that children do anything or respond to that or have to answer. Shared book reading has been around for a long time and has received a lot of attention as a valuable way of building children's emergent literacy. Adult-child book reading, as you can see in the picture, is familiar, natural and collaborative activity for both early childhood educators and parents. And it's a really valuable way of exposing children to rich language models, story grammar and vocabulary beyond what we might talk about in day-to-day. So if it's about a witch or something that just doesn't come up in our day-to-day conversation. So benefits for vocabulary knowledge and vocabulary growth and knowledge building are so valuable from shared book reading. If we can go to the next slide, and I just will focus a bit more on dialogic book reading, which Rebecca talked about as having a growing evidence base as an intervention. This involves shared book reading in a similar way, but there's less focus on getting through the story in the end of the book, but much more focus on the adults using explicit and targeted, evocative, open-ended questions when reading with children. So they might do things such as ask open-ended questions and avoiding yes-no questions to discuss content. Maybe it's about the book, or maybe it's about, have you ever thought that you might meet a witch, or something a little bit outside the book. Yeah, posing further questions to children's responses. So again, not being so guided by the book totally. Again, expanding on children's language when you're talking about the book. Simply providing praise and reinforcement for engaging with the book, which builds written language and print awareness, and essentially following the interests of the child during the discussion rather than being focused on finishing the book. This can be very important for parents or carers where English is not the first language, or parents don't have English literacy skills. They can still pick up a book of any type and go through it and talk about the book, look at the pictures and discuss what's going on as well. And I would also reinforce very strongly that books can be read in the home language as well, because I very much, and not because I think so, but because the evidence tells us that children who grow up bi or multilingual may have a little bit of difficulty sorting out their languages at the start, but they tend to often overtake their monolingual peers in the mid-primary years around language and literacy. So there's key strategies around building language and emergent literacy. But if we now start to think about vulnerability, just to unpack a little bit more around vulnerability with oral language. This 30 million word gap is a study that many of you may have heard about before. It's quite a seminal study done by Hart and Risley. And in that study, they tracked children from families from 3 different social groupings. Those on welfare, those who they considered working class, which they define in their paper, and those who are much more advantaged. And they did a number of measures, but this 30 million word gap is a statement saying that by age 4, the children from families on welfare had heard 10 million words, and the children from advantaged families had heard 40 million words, hence the name 30 million word gap. So regardless of their biological capacity, their interest in language, children who come from families on welfare or socially much more disadvantaged are already starting well behind the children who come from more privileged families, simply just because of exposure to language and particularly around vocabulary. We just go to the next slide, and maybe Rebecca, you can just flick through right to the very last one, because I've broken them up. There are both innate factors why a child might have vulnerability in language growth, and there are also environmental factors. And I'd just like to discuss some of those. This is not an exhaustive list, but some of the typical innate factors include developmental difficulties of the child themselves, perhaps a sensory impairment in maybe in hearing and or vision, a biomedical condition which might involve a genetic syndrome or other developmental difficulties. Some children have a developmental language disorder, which is defined as an unexpected difficulty in learning language compared to their peers. Chronic ill health, we know, can be a significant interruption to child's learning language, because there are much bigger things that are going on about survival. And we do know that language difficulties can run in families. So a history of language vulnerabilities there's about a 1 in 2 chance that can be inherited. In terms of the environmental factors, both Rebecca and I have already highlighted the fact that social disadvantage unfortunately remains as a risk factor, and there remains a social gradient around children's likelihood of being really well prepared in language skills and emergent literacy as they are about to enter school. Other factors include child maltreatment and trauma. We know that that is a big interference, a stumbling block for children's language growth. Once again, there's a lot of biological changes that happen because as a result of maltreatment and trauma, and we know that these children need accelerated support with their language growth as well. Evidence continues to point to the fact that unfortunately maternal level of education is a risk factor, along with home language and literacy environment, which Rebecca talked about. But again, that's simply the degree of the richness of the language and the access to books and shared dialogic book reading in the home environment. When those don't happen regularly, these also can put a child to be making them very vulnerable with their language growth. Similarly, maternal mental health, including postnatal depression, we know is a risk factor for that ongoing serve and return mechanism that can and ideally should be occurring to foster children's language growth. And research continues to show us, in fact, quite recently, that a child's ability in language at age 4 is the strongest predictor of their language at age 7 when they're well into school. So this is a strong predictor. So the more prepared and more robust a child's language is as they're about to enter school is a strong predictor of how their language will be when they're at age 7. We can move on to the next slide. And I'd like to acknowledge that language is paradoxical. I've spoken about the fact that it's naturally acquired, yet I've also spoken about the fact that many children experience risks to their language growth. So we know that humans have evolved a special facility for oral language, and that differentiates us from other mammals because we have this innate ability to acquire language, which gives us this generative ability to communicate about anything and everything. So we call language biologically primary. However, we know that language development is vulnerable to a range of both innate conditions and environmental conditions as well. So it is kind of paradoxical. Just to give you some context, and if you can just, Rebecca, just scroll through all of the bits on this slide, I'd just like to share with you the results of one study. It's not a new study, but it still remains a very powerful study where the authors had a group of children who had poor language skills, were behind in their development of language prior to going to school, and their reading skills were followed up over time. In fact, I've presented the data for grades 2 and 4, but data extends right to year 10 as well. So the children that entered school with language skills that were on par, in grade 2, 8.6% of those children were struggling with reading and 8.2% were struggling in grade 4. So it's not a complete protection for learning to read, but the numbers are, we'd like it to be lower, but they're, under 10%. So there are obviously other factors contributing to struggles with reading at school. But if we compare the numbers of children who entered school with less well-developed language and looked at how they're going with reading at school, you can see the numbers are quite different. So in grade 2, nearly 60% of children who entered school with less well-developed language are struggling with reading. And by grade 4, it's reduced a little bit, but it's still close to 50%. So we can see how strong language skills at school entry are a protective factor for learning to read, and we know that learning to read has such big implications both for school and beyond. So it's almost as if children have to cross a bridge from their language development as they're moving into the literacy domain, as shown by this child. Some careful steps need to be taken, but the stronger it is at the start, the more likely success will be at the other end with literacy. On the next slide, I'm not going to talk about this in detail, but the reference is there for Pam Snow's paper called The Science of Language and Reading, and she's built a house, as you can see, talking about oral language competence as a solid foundation in early life. If you just Google that title, the paper is freely available as well, and it's a really powerful story about how children need solid social and emotional context at the start of their life, and their early oral language experiences in 0 to 5 is the foundation, literally, as that we need solid foundations to a house for what is ultimately the goals at the top: marketable, employability, academic achievement, and so forth. So I won't talk to that slide in great detail, but I'm happy to take any questions about that in the end. So to finish up, and in terms of reinforcing Rebecca's comments and the report that she and Lauren Renshaw have worked so hard on, a universal early language and literacy strategies. They're strategies to optimise growth of language and emergent literacy for all children, with a particular focus on children who are vulnerable for language and emergent literacy growth, keeping in mind that there might be innate factors, environmental factors, or both contributing to vulnerability. So those children who are vulnerable or have additional needs need accelerated intervention. We want to try and close the gap so that there's a much more level playing field when children enter school. So seeking ultimately to even out that start line when children commence school as well. So thank you very much. There's my email and Twitter if you have any questions, but I'll now try to unshare, and I'm happy to take some questions. So Rebecca or Paul, could you let me know if I can be seen at the moment?
You can.
Okay.
You can. Thank you so much, Tanya. We do have a number of questions, so we'll get into some of them. The first few cover the programs that I spoke about in that national call out. So there's been quite a few questions around how do we see what programs are there. All the programs are all listed in the evidence review, which are on the Early Language and Literacy website. They're on table 2. And there were other questions around the specific programs that had the independent evaluations attached to them. And in that table, you will see at what stage the evaluations are at for each of those programs. So if you go to the information tab on that website, you'll see both the discussion paper and the 2 evidence reviews. So it's on the universal evidence review, you can find all the information around the programs. Then another question has been, how can we be involved in the strategy development? There is a closed working group at the moment, but one of the big reasons that we released the discussion paper publicly was to receive general feedback on that. So I'm the best person to email that feedback or thoughts to. So my email is up on that slide now, rebecca.goodhue@araci.org.au, and we would love to hear what people are thinking, particularly around those proposed priorities. A question from Laurel is asking, does NELLC take into account cultures that do not rely on reading to impart knowledge, learning, etc.? And that was asked before you started speaking, Tanya, so it could have been answered by your presentation, and particularly when you're talking about oral language. But also, if you, Laurel, and anyone else who's interested in this, are able to read the discussion paper, you'll see that we talk about how literacy, and I'm just going to read this out of the discussion paper. Literacy is a complex process occurring beyond the primary reading and writing skills, includes social, cultural, digital, gestural, and artistic communication. So it's in alignment with that multi-literacy concept that we see individuals as making meaning from linguistic, visual, audio, spatial, and gestural input. So yes, is the short answer to your question, Laurel. We also had a question from Carol asking, how does this relate to the reading wars that are happening in primary schools? And I'm definitely going to pass that one to you, Tanya.
Okay, look, great question, something that I've spent a lot of time reading, writing, and thinking about it, but I have to say it doesn't really articulate directly to the reading wars. Just for if people aren't familiar with the reading wars, it's in very brief. There's been lots of debate, discussion for nearly 50 years now about the best way to teach children to read, and it comes down to, oversimplified a bit, but a view that reading is more natural, or a view that reading is an unnatural skill. So I certainly sit on the side of reading being a biologically secondary or more unnatural skill, and that's based on research evidence, not my personal views. But why I say the NELLC strategy doesn't directly speak to the reading wars is we know the better prepared that we can get young children to be when they enter school, the more equipped they are with their language, their background knowledge and expansive vocabulary, their knowledge about how the print works. They're just going to be better equipped to learn to read, whatever way the teachers are teaching or their school approaches teaching of reading. I'm from Victoria, and there's quite a lot of variability in go from school to school and from one suburb or one corner to the next, and see quite different approaches to reading instruction. I don't think that that's that ideal for lots of sort of logistic reasons if children move schools, and there are some approaches that are more evidence-based than others. But I guess at the, in some, the more prepared it's literally, I feel like it's like filling children up with all that good stuff before they get to school. They'll be less vulnerable to what actually occurs at school if they're being taught in methods that maybe don't necessarily align with what best evidence tells us. So I hope that answers the question to a degree. So certainly don't see it as fitting in with a particular theoretical approach to reading. That's a very big part of my own work, but I really see this as preparing children, filling them up so well so that they are ready to take on the instruction and well equipped, that the teachers aren't needing to go back and fill in a lot of gaps that is often the case at the moment.
Excellent, thanks so much, Tanya. And the next question is from Megan regarding the evidence and the strategy. How do they apply to children in bilingual families or homes where English isn't spoken? So Megan, around the evidence, there was that targeted, within the targeted evidence review, we looked at that culturally and linguistically diverse families, and that is in the evidence reviews on the website more fully. And in terms of this strategy, it is something that we probably need to workshop a bit more further, but we have considered that, and in that first priority, we talk about ensuring families and support services having access to books in first languages of that community wherever possible. But if you have further ideas around that, please feel free to email us. Did you want to add to that at all, Tanya?
Only to say, I think, some 20, 25 years ago, parents were advised to try and speak English to their children, and we know that that's completely not supported by the evidence, and there's lots of linguistic and cultural problems with that. So I would concur with what you said, Rebecca, and children are so primed to learn language that unless there is a specific reason for a vulnerability, they should really be encouraged to use their home language, and they will be exposed to English because it's going to be all around them, certainly when they enter the early childhood education and definitely at school.
Great, thank you. So time for two more questions. One more question, I'm being told. Would it be helpful for ECECs to have speech pathologists on staff? Both Tanya and I are speech pathologists, and I will go first and say I absolutely think so. I think as a speechie, we can upskill a lot of the educators around communication generally, work with the families, how implement programs, but also going back to the point we made earlier around how we need to ensure that all the educators and everyone who is working in those early education contexts have pre-service training around early language and literacy and ongoing professional development. So yes, I think it would be helpful, but we also need to do more for the educators themselves who are working directly. Did you want to add to that, Tanya?
No, you've said it so well. I absolutely agree. And actually, I will add one small comment.
Yeah.
I recently finished, just published a paper, which is also will be freely available, but looking at Australian speech pathologists' views about where they feel their services are most needed in the literacy area. So from preschool, I know it's different terms across different states in Australia, right through to secondary school. And in fact, their role, the view was that they felt that the greatest need was in the preschool years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would make sense. Thank you so much, Tanya, and I'll pass you back to Paul.
Right. Well, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, Tanya, for today's webinar. And thanks to the audience for participation and for your good questions. Technology allowing, this webinar recording will be freely available on the Eracy website with a link advertised in our weekly newsletter, very likely this Friday. So if you're not already a subscriber to our weekly newsletter, please sign up at eracy.org.au/register. That's at eracy.org.au/register. Completely free, comes out every Friday, loaded with goodies, including recordings of webinars like this. So thanks again to both our presenters. Thanks to everyone who participated. And just a reminder that we have a roundtable on tomorrow talking about mental health. It's being jointly co-hosted by Eracy and UNICEF, and it includes Patrick McGorry, Nari Brown, Dr. Vine from the Chief Mental Health Officer of Australia, and Frank Overclade. So join us for that one tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Thanks everyone, and goodbye.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you.